Please welcome to the stage with Open UK, Amanda Brock.
So, good morning, Austin. I guess this room knows a lot about open source, and you all know that we're all about community, we're all about collaboration, and we're all about conference. And how good is it to be back in the room together today? So I want to thank Percona for bringing me to the world's biggest database conference in open source. And I want to thank all of you for making the effort to be in this room today, because I know it's been a tough few years and it's hard to get everybody back together, but I think it's brilliant for us, so thank you very much. And I guess you're probably wondering what a nice girl like me is doing in a space like open source. Well, about 14 years ago, I worked for a company called Canonical, who some of you may know. And we were the commercial sponsor of the open source operating system, Ubuntu. Back then, we were the cool kids on the block, or at least we thought so. And I worked there for 5 years. I'm an ex-lawyer. I spent 25 years as a lawyer, and 5 of them in Canonical. And there was a bit of an accident happen when I joined Canonical. I was meant to come in as a corporate tech lawyer and to build out this legal team. And what actually happened was I fell passionately in love with open source, and that was just never on the agenda. So since then, I've worked in a number of different roles, and I do a lot of pro bono work. I sit on a number of advisory boards. I chaired one for the UN, Tech for Good, and in particular open source in that space is a big passion of mine. And this year, I stood for and was elected as a member of the Open Source Initiatives Board. And it's quite a big thing to take on, and I've taken it on because I thoroughly believe in some of what Peter was saying about open source. And unfortunately, the OSI doesn't own the trademark in open source. But open source has a clear meaning, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about what that is today, and what is open source and what isn't. I am the editor of a book being published in September. Now, the great thing about the book is it has 20-odd authors. It will bring lots and lots of skills and resources and information about open source to everybody, and it will be really expensive. But it will also be open access. And that open access means that that information, those skills from all these lawyers and policy people all over the world, governance people, people who understand how to build community, that will all be shared for free, which I'm really pleased about. And I can promise you, it is the only time you will see my name on the front of a book that I've edited. I will never be doing that again. I also speak a lot, and I do a lot of this traveling around talking to people about open source. And as we started the Roaring 20s, I was quite excited because I had 20 keynotes lined up for 2020, and I did 0. They were all digital. It was heartbreaking. So for me, the year got off to a great start as we started to look at what was happening in open source, but it didn't quite work out the way I expected. And I suspect that's the last couple of years have been the same for all of you. And in Europe, and I saw this morning, to my surprise, the bulk of people being from Europe, but I guess they're logged in early, they started a digital decade. Now, I'm guessing that, like me, you probably think the digital decade was the last one. But this digital transformation that's happening at pace has now hit the point where every nation state, every government is looking at the infrastructure it has for its citizens being built on software, and that software is inevitably open source. So all of the services traditionally supplied bricks and mortar are now being digitalized. And what we're seeing there is the rise of open source, of course, because everything infrastructure-wise is being built on it. And there is some really interesting work coming out of the UK looking at government as database and saying that government is as good as the database it runs. Now, I don't normally read from slides, and I don't normally have many words on my slides, but this, I think, was really important. And this is the EU President, Ursula von der Leyen, writing to Margrethe Vestager when she appointed her in 2019. Now, Vestager had been the competition, the antitrust commissioner in Europe for nearly a decade, and there are few people who understand the money in tech more than that lady does. And in this appointment, von der Leyen says to her, the changes in digital technologies and geopolitics are already having a profound effect on the lives of Europeans. We're witnessing major shifts all the way from global power structures to local politics. What we do now will determine what kind of world our children live in, and will define Europe's place in the world, creating a Europe fit for the digital age. Now, you can swap that. You can stick US in there, I can stick UK in there, we can stick Asia in there. You can pretty much do what you want with it, but it's true for all of us. What we do now is going to affect the future for our children. And the next thing that we did in the UK was we Brexited. For anyone who doesn't know what that means, it means we exited the EU. And this picture was taken at FOSDEM, the last conference that I went to face-to-face. And it was taken at FOSDEM 2020, and it's outside the Commission at midnight on the 31st, or it's actually 11:59, on the 31st of January. And what happened next was the Commission put the lights out. And I don't know if they put the lights out every night at midnight or if they were just making a point to the Brits from FOSDEM gathered outside, but we were out. And it's important because it started a lot of thinking about what this meant digitally. And we see Europe starting to talk about digital and data sovereignty, about bringing data home, looking at how it balances its own ecosystem of tech supply chain, how it balances citizen data being private and protected with the ability to make money out of data. And then, of course, along came the pandemic. And this is the little-known Scottish variant, which is actually easier because you can hear it coming. A laugh about the pandemic, something that doesn't happen every day. There's not a lot to laugh about. It's been a rough couple of years. And in some ways, it's been good for open source, but I'll come back to that later. So as that was happening, we saw digitalization for anybody who was sort of reluctant, as a reluctant technologist, happen at pace. And we saw Europe in particular really publicly, really openly redefine its boundaries. And we saw this case Schrems 2, where the arrangement between the US and Europe for the shift of data, the privacy shield, was set aside in a court case. And we also saw a bunch of legislation that I won't go into in detail, but which was focusing on big tech, which was focusing on how they brought the digital structure back to being European. And one way that's been done is through something called Gaia X. And talking to a couple of people, I don't think the US is quite as familiar with it. And it's a data infrastructure for Europe. It's a digital and data sovereign infrastructure. And it's built on open source, and a lot of it is going to be about open data. And as you start with that sovereignty piece, what's particularly interesting is that you see Asian companies and the big US tech companies all being part of it. We were interested in Open UK. I stuck my neck out, and we've been a day one member, because part of what open source is about is global collaboration. And as we Brexited, we had some difficult times with some of our European colleagues, and I had to remind them that it's not local source, it's open source, and it's global. So we've been part of this from the beginning. And in Europe, you don't just see this interaction with the UK or with the US, you also see it with China and Asia. But it's not just Europe. Then you start to see this geopolitical shift in the States, and the States and China, and even the UK and China. And it spreads from being nation states into citizen activism. And we see Black Lives Matter, and we see youth action at COP26. Open UK had a big event at COP26, and I'll talk to you more as we go on about the place of open source and sustainability, and I mean ecological and sustainable development goals type sustainability. But again, youth action, and then a war. I mean, what kind of couple of years have we had, and what's that done to open source? So depending on whose reports you look at, it's going to tell you that between 58 and 98% of any software stack is open source. But that really depends on how you define what open source is and how you understand it. Now, if I was to ask everybody in this room to start to define open source, I could probably put you in the four corners, maybe more, with different definitions. And your definition is very much going to depend on your experience, your personal experience of open source. Peter talked about foundations. If you've come through that route with the big companies collaborating, for you, that's probably open source. If you've come up a community route, you probably think it's that. One thing I suspect we'll get agreement on is that it's software that is shared in the open, that follows the open source definition and has an OSI-approved license. And even if any of you in the room don't agree with that, if you look across governments, if you look across the public sectors as they're evolving, you'll see that's what government is looking for. Now, there's a problem with that. It's fine as a basic definition, and it's good if we're measuring against that in terms of how much is being adopted. But there's also a risk. And often when we see people move to open source, they do it because they want to have an economic benefit. We did a survey last year, again, I'll talk to you about it in a minute, and I was gutted. I was really upset that the main reason people use open source is cost saving, according to our survey. So if we look first at that cost saving piece, they do it to avoid lock-in, they do it because they think they can recycle and reuse software. That's not going to happen if you throw software over the wall onto a repo like GitHub, stick an open source license on it and don't touch it. If you don't have the good governance, if you don't have the good hygiene, if you haven't got documentation, if you haven't got a way of stewarding that code over time, if you haven't got maintenance, it's not going to be usable. So, you're wasting money. So I think open source, we have to start to acknowledge that it's more than that strict definition, but we also have to remember that that strict definition is what we should be writing down when we do. And as we look at this sort of rise in open source, where has it come from over the last decade? And I have three things that I think have really caused it. I think the first is the rise in the status of the developer. So I used to work very hard at Canonical, and I worked very long hours with people in the US, and I spent 5 years of my life becoming a parrot. And I became a parrot who could explain why open source wasn't the risk that other lawyers and procurement people thought it was, and it was quite exhausting. That's not needed anymore. To get open source into a business, you no longer have to go through legal and procurement. The developer chooses. And the developer is able to choose to some extent because they have the access to open source software on Git-based repos. So before we had that, you couldn't do it. And it was a very different market selling services around open source and persuading people to use it. So we've seen this shift with the developer status elevating and their ability to just choose what they want to use, which is a great thing. It's also open to abuse, which Peter mentioned, where you have this, I think it was Mongo who described open source as a marketing tool. If we talk about what open source is, I'll accept lots of things. I'll accept that it's a socio-political movement. I'll accept that it's a methodology for development. What I and anybody who has any understanding of open source will never accept is that it's a business model. And that's been public, and that's been in reports since 2008. Matt Aslett wrote a 451 report in October 2008, and the thing that was identified there is open source is not a business model. So for the last, 2022, 14 years, we've all known that. And anybody who doesn't build a business understanding that hasn't done their homework. So if I go back to what it is that has changed, the third thing, and again, Peter and I picked up on the same image. This is an image that Dan Cohn created. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but for Cloud Native, and I think Peter's is much more up to date than mine. But when you see the scale of open source in the cloud space, it's just an inevitability. Now, fangirl picture, but, and sadly, I normally get a new one every year when I go to the Open Source Summit. I haven't had one for a couple of years. It's a little bit out of date. But don't listen to us. When I joined Canonical, public enemy number one was Microsoft. Bug zero was the destruction of Microsoft. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer talked about open source being a cancer. We live in a different world. I think Microsoft is probably the biggest single contributor by lines of code to open source today. And this is my mate Steve Wally at Microsoft keynoting Open Source Summit live in Edinburgh. And he explains that as being down to 3 reasons. And the reasons are that today customers ask for open source because they know it's the best software. Microsoft runs a cloud product, you might have heard of it, and you can't do cloud without open source today. And the third reason he gives is developers, and particularly the younger developers who've never used anything but it and the methodologies that go around it. Now that comes with some challenges around skills and learning, and I sort of feel that we've in some ways failed that generation. We haven't passed over all the information that the early stage open source people had about why things have to be done a certain way. And that skills development is something that really needs rectified. You know, if you read Matt Acey talks about this being an inevitability and that the young developers aren't interested and they don't care. And I totally 100% disagree with him. I think we just haven't built that skill set for them, and we need to own that, all of us. So of course, talking about what's happened through the Roaring 20s so far, I've mentioned the pandemic already. In some ways, it was good for open source. I mean, we're used to working at home to some extent. We're used to dispersed working. There's all of that. But actually, when you look at the government responses to it, you see that the underlying tools bring in open source software. I'm not going to call out the British government as being a particularly good example, but I am going to call out the Germans. And they licensed their app on Apache. They had over 2,000 contributions from the community to that app because they built it in the open. And now what we're seeing is that a number of these apps and the tools for the pandemic are sitting in the Linux Foundation. Peter hadn't seen my slide deck when he did his, but many of you will be familiar with this news story. And I was quite excited about it because open source was in the New York Times. You know, that doesn't happen every day. And it was the end of 2020, and there was apparently a meeting of 7 leaders of companies that were open source, companies who had built a business model around open source, and they were very unhappy in the cloud environment because they felt that the cloud companies were strip mining their assets, strip mining their open source software. So just to make sure that I say this, I want to be really clear. When you put software out into the world as open source, that is what it is. You can't take it back. You can't say you didn't mean it. It's out there, it's open source, it's there forever. You can change later, of course, and you can make the next release proprietary, but there is absolutely nothing that you can do about what you've shared. And you have to think through your business model before you do that sharing. So when I left Canonical, I spent a couple of years working with startups that wanted to be open source companies. And they came to me and they were all fresh-faced and excited. And of course, I'd gone through Canonical. I'd gone through this whole shift to the cloud. We took 70% of the cloud market overnight. Do you think we took revenue to match that? So I knew what the score was in cloud back around 2012. I said to them, what if? So you put your software out there, and what if someone else uses it? Well, that's kind of the point of open source. Mostly they were fine. What if you put it out there and someone else makes money from it? And some of them were getting uncomfortable at that point. What if you put it out there and you make some money, or even you make a lot of money, but somebody else makes more? And at least half of them never came back to me. And they were right, because if you haven't got a business model that you're going to be comfortable with, that's going to sustain, then you shouldn't open source the code. You should think long and hard about what you're doing and understand what you want out of it. And we saw the opposite of that happening. Clearly, whoever advised Elastic didn't take them through the what-if theory. And they came in early 2021 with this doubling down on open part 2. Now, it's absolutely fine if a company doesn't want to do open source software. I think they're making a mistake, but that's up to them. And if a company doesn't have the right business model, because open source is not a business model, to sustain their business whilst distributing open source, they shouldn't. They should be proprietary. But the real issue is that we've had this spate of disingenuous, to use a lawyer's word, activity. Calling a clause the commons clause gives the absolute implication that it's part of the commons. So if what it does is make code proprietary, that's misleading. If you say you're doubling down on open, I had to look at what that term meant. It's now very, very popular in the UK, but I'd never heard it before. And it apparently means that you're playing some sort of football game and you're doing something and you're really committed to open. That's not what this is. This is a shift away from open source. And unfortunately, despite much of the debate that goes on, something is either open source or it's proprietary. There is currently no in-between. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have an in-between, but somebody has to go and invest in that. And it will take a lot of energy and a lot of money to create the movement for public source, shared source, whatever you want to call it, not to be proprietary software. Right now, it is very clearly proprietary. And we see this sort of business attack and, using open source as a marketing tool and shifting away, lift and shift once you've got to a stage where you've made enough money or you've locked your customers in. But that's not the only attacks that we're seeing. There's a real problem coming to the fore right now with standards. And what we see here is another attack on revenue. So a lot of the pushback we get around open source in business is around revenue. And of course, it's disruptive, right? So it comes into your sector, you think this is brilliant, I've got something free, I'm going to use it. With a bit of luck, you learn about hygiene and compliance and you do good governance. But if you have a revenue stream that's disrupted by that, you're not going to be happy. And what we see is patent licensing making a lot of money for companies in the mobile network operations and in the SOC and other spaces. And their standard essential patents that sit within their closed standards are problematic. And they're problematic because they require something more than the open source license for the open source to be used. And the real issue is that the companies who are coming to the table are massive. They have a lot of money. They're bringing lots and lots of resource to argue this battle. And effectively, what they want to create is something that I would call frowned source. And it's kind of like open source apart from my patent revenue. And it's just a real problem that we all need to be aware of and ready to take on. And the challenges that we see in open source are broader than just business models. We have this security piece, and let's own the elephant in the room. I'll start by saying that security is not an open source issue. Security is a software issue. So as we digitalize, we have to look at security for all software. The US has taken real leadership, and that's to be admired. The Biden order last May, Open UK responded to that, looked at supply chain, asked for SBOMs in open source, which is exactly the right thing to do. And then we saw Log4j, and we saw the impact of that. But how are we going to do this? And we've seen the US government last week had a second meeting with the OpenSSF and Linux Foundation, about 50 people in the room, I'm told. Very US-centric, but looking at how do they fix it. And I think there are tens of millions of dollars going into this 10-point strategy. Open UK is also a member of OpenSSF, and I think it's great. But what we need to be really clear and really sure about is that we have an international, joined-up approach to fixing these problems. Because again, it's not local source, it's open source. And we all have to have skin in the game on this. And it is, as I say, because we're seeing national infrastructure across the world move to open source. So back in January, I was part of an advisory board to this energy digitalization task force for the UK. And it recommends that the UK energy system infrastructure is moved to a digital spine built on open source. We're just going to see more and more of this. And what it means is that we have to think about how we fund. And that funding, I think, has to move. Not only does it have to be internationalized, not only does it have to involve governments, but we have to start to think about what open source is. It's in the Commons. The Commons Clause is not, open source is. But then you start to look at public good and the role that open source is playing in this digitalization of all our national infrastructures. And we have to think about how governments are going to fund it. We have to think about sustainability. I said we had an event at COP26. We're going to host a one-year-on event in October. And at that, we delivered a couple of things. We delivered the open source strategy, and we delivered a blueprint on the data center of the future. At this year's event, we're going to deliver an EV charging blueprint entirely built on open source, working with a Dutch organization. And of course, I mentioned the other things that we've been going through in this digital roaring 20s, and the war, which has already been referenced a couple of times today in Ukraine. And I think this was either the 8th or the 12th of March. It was a Twitter call. Some of you might even have been on it. There were about 800 people listening to developers in Ukraine. And I tell you, it was heartbreaking. So Anne and I were talking before about how to do this without crying. I'm a crybaby, and I'm trying not to. These young men were not coding, they were taking up arms, and that's what they were having to do. And we wanted to do something to help them. So we set up an open source link with the Red Cross to try and take donations. It's technically a UK link, but anybody can contribute to it. And we've been trying to help a number of women developers get out of Ukraine and come to the UK. Other people took different approaches, and there is a bit of a problem here. So open source does not discriminate between fields of endeavor and between people. And what we've seen is this protest where open source won't work in Russia. And one of the hardest, I'm going to cry even more, sorry. One of the hardest things I've ever done was say no to a friend in Ukraine in April. And what they were doing was looking at how to make this software not work in Russia. And of course, I said no. And it wasn't easy. Unfortunately, we now get to move on from the war. I've mentioned a couple of other things. that have come up through the pandemic. And of course, there's this belonging, this diversity that's really important. Open UK is an organization that's really flourished in the last couple of years. I'm very proud to have led it through that phase, but it's not about any one person. It's about this UK leadership and global collaboration. And we have 2 staff, and we have all of these good people who some of you will recognize as international leaders in open source who work with us and volunteer their time. Many of them are currently at KubeCon. And what we do is we look at 3 things. We look at community, legal and policy, and learning. And on the community side, we showcase what's going on in the UK. We have awards. We bring people together to give them a voice. And we use that to influence legal and policy. And we do that by responding to legislation in the UK and Europe. We've been recognized quite early stage in Europe. We were part of the Google Oracle litigation in the US. We put in an amicus brief with some other open source companies, and we responded to the Biden ordinance. Last year, we created 3 phases of reports where we looked at the data that was available that had never been cut for the UK before, and we showed the numbers and the level of open source adoption in the UK. And we did a survey that supported that, and lots of brilliant case studies. And this is the kind of data we got out of it. And what you see here is using formula that I don't like that came from the commission that looks at sort of total cost of ownership, number of developers, number of lines of code, which I think is really old school. I think it's old school because it looks at this equivalency through total cost of ownership rather than value added. But on that, we can show 20% of the digital economy is based on open source in the UK. I suspect it's nearer 60. We also know, although we can't prove because the stats haven't been shared anywhere, that as we Brexited, Europe thought that it went from 490,000 to 260,000 open source developers. So almost half of them are in the UK, which is partly why it's been possible for us to have the reach we've got. Now, for anybody listening, I suspect there are more listening than in the room from the UK, please complete our survey. Anybody based in the UK can do it. If any of you have colleagues in the UK, please share it. What it does is start to ask questions that have never been asked before around this governance and good hygiene that I've been talking about. And the last thing we do is we work on learning and skills development. And we've distributed about 8,000 of these little gloves. And the gloves are based on a software glove by the singer Imogen Heap. Ariana Grande toured with the glove. So we find that it has a real attraction to young women. And we've created 2 courses that are available Creative Commons. The second one in particular appeals to me because the 10 lessons are based on the 10 definitions of the open source definition and the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's all done in a very light, fun way. It's all animated, completely Creative Commons. If anybody's interested, take it, it's yours. And you can work out how to make the gloves online. We also were a runner-up in the GNOME Community Challenge. And I just wanted to show you what a small grassroots organization like ours can do. So we work with an amazing press agency, comms company, OneBite, who have helped us with this. And we have this Twitter impact that's way beyond our size because of the great people we're made up for. So what I would say, just to conclude, is that we've managed to achieve quite a lot as a small organization. The battle is still ongoing. The war is not won. And for open source to really take the pride of place that it should in the next decade, it not only has to be the open source tiger this year, but it has to roar through the next decade. And that requires all of our global collaboration. Thank you.